Why hello my fellow apes, I hope you are well. Today I'm going to sort many of the most popular arguments for God's existence into a juicy tier list, and you won't believe what I consider S tier.
So what do you want to talk about today?
I'm here to talk about the argument from trees.
Now, credit where credit is due.
Well, why you boring me? I'm right.
Yeah, that was pretty bad. Credit where credit is due, Drew McCoy from Genetically Modified Skeptic, you might have heard of him, created a video based on this very concept a few years ago, and then recently Alex O'Connor and Joe Schmid did the same, having a cute disagreement over where to put Anselm's Ontological argument.
I still don't like that Anselm is all the way down there.
And Alex is, of course, entitled to his wrong opinion. And likewise, I'm now going to share with you my wrong opinion, so consider that a disclaimer. In the form of the Trinity, though making a lot more sense, I'm going to rank each argument for God's existence according to three categories. The first will be result, which refers to how close the argument, if sound, affirms traditional theism. You know, the triomni God of Abraham, an all-powerful, all-loving and all-knowing being. The second category will be intuition, which refers to how easily people comprehend and instinctively affirm the premises. And the third category will be refutation, which refers to how effectively the argument withstands refutation. I'll measure each argument according to these three standards, and then place them in a tier list, with S containing the maximally great and D the maximally worst. What of E and F, I hear you ask? Well, to put it bluntly, there's a lot of theistic arguments that are so crap as not to warrant my time. So I'm sorry, not sorry, but if you think that the trees are just so beautiful that there must be a God, then please, for the sake of us all, go pray for an ounce of critical thinking. Capiche? Now, despite having studied philosophy and theology for quite some time, I am an autodidact. I haven't been through the academy. And so what I've done is I've had professionals from various fields check over the relevant segments. So to give you an example of this, Joe Schmid has very kindly looked over the Kalam segment and the Contingency segment. And I've had John Perry from Stated Clearly or Stated Casually. He's looked over anything that's to do with biology. So I've done what I can to make sure that I've dot the I's and cross the T's, as it were. Also, and naturally, you're not going to get in this video every dialectical pathway for every argument. That's just not what this video is about. But I will touch upon the most compelling threads and provide further reading. And on this note, you can find in the description my script. And if you open the script, you'll find resources and links to arguments, names, and all sorts of other things. Right then, let's have some fun, shall we? First and foremost, we have everyone's least favourite uncle's philosophical summit, Pascal's wager, or as your uncle more eloquently puts it, what if you're wrong and end up in hell? Don't you want divine cupcakes in heaven? You should believe in God just in case he exists. Derived from Blaise Pascal's posthumously published work, Ponzes, this argument is extremely popular and is formally presented through a decision matrix. In a nutshell, it states that if you believe in God and God doesn't exist, then you'll suffer only finite loss in death. But if God does exist, you'll gain infinite pleasure through heaven. And on the flip side, if you don't believe in God and God doesn't exist, you'll gain only finite pleasure while alive. Whereas if God does exist, you'll stand to lose the infinite pleasure of heaven, or worse, suffer infinite torment in hell. Yeah, it's basically an absurd insurance policy against an evil being that issues punishment and reward not based on moral virtue, but rather sufficient grovelling. So, how does the wager perform in our three categories? In terms of result, this argument initially seems to rank extremely high. Not only is the wager employed specifically in the service of the Abrahamic God, but when pushed on scriptural interpretations, the proponent will typically precisify their argument to their very specific denomination. So perhaps Pascal is off to a very strong start. Well, no. Technically speaking, Pascal's wager isn't actually an argument for God's existence at all. If sound, it wouldn't substantiate the existence of anything other than perhaps that we should maximize utility. So I'd say that Pascal is actually off to an awful start. What about intuition? How easily do people comprehend and instinctively affirm the premises? Well, considering the argument's popularity among laypeople, we've got to admit that Pascal scores very well here. The wager is easy to communicate, easy to understand, and is evidently intuitively striking. After all, if the wager didn't perform well in these areas, then it wouldn't be your uncle's magnus opus, would it? So while Pascal might perform poorly in the result category, it performs excellently in intuition. But has it held up to scrutiny? What do philosophers and even theologians make of it? Well, how do I put this? If we left a snowman in Death Valley for a few centuries, it would genuinely retain its integrity better than Pascal's wager has over the same period. I mean, maybe I'm being a bit harsh here, but seriously, the wager isn't very popular among contemporary apologists, and it's for a number of reasons. Here's just a few of them. The most prominent response to the wager is known as the many gods objection, which notes that for every imaginable god, there is an equally imaginable god that has equal consequences for inverse actions. So while your uncle might urge you to wager on his god that requires you to take a stance on abortion, homosexuality and so on, his mate will urge you to wager on his god that requires opposite views on each matter. Or to put it another way, suppose that there is a god and that this god rewards those who nurture authenticity and intellect. In this case, buying the wager would ironically reduce one's pleasure, as it would be an act of defying authenticity and intellect. So basically, since there's so many possibilities that threaten infinite consequences, we're all doomed in any case. Another frequent objection is of moral concern. Can you conceive of an all-loving God forever forsaking his children for sincerely and earnestly not being convinced of a few propositions? Well, I can't, and so I'd go so far as to say that this is a contradiction and thus assign no chance to such a being existing. For me, then, wagering on such a god's existence really is a fool's game. By my lights, Pascalian gods exchange their all-loving attribute for all petulance. Such gods are not even worth our pity, let alone our praise. And then there's doxastic voluntarism, the view that people have voluntary control over their beliefs. Pascal's wager presumes doxastic voluntarism, since it presumes, in one way or another, that we can choose what we believe. But can we? It's an interesting question, but I think that Thomas Nagel hits the nail on the head when he says that beliefs are largely a matter of luck, since our beliefs are predicated on where we're born, what period we're born in, our culture, our brain chemistry, our experiences, and our exposure to different arguments and facts. Or to come at this from another angle, do you earnestly believe that you can convince yourself that the Earth is flat? Me neither. Finally, at least for now, there's this little problem that Pascal and proponents presume that we should always maximize expected utility, and yet as the St. Petersburg paradox, among other things, has demonstrated, it's generally accepted that we shouldn't act to maximize utility in all circumstances. Thus, the very founding proposition of Pascal's wager is undercut. But yeah, you get the point. The wager suffers from an avalanche of compelling refutation, and so it shouldn't even really make the F tier. However, I'm going to generously put it in the D tier, and I'm going to do so on account of it being so damn popular. If you want to engage with theists, you're almost certainly, one day or another, going to have to engage with Pascal's wager. Next up, we have the mighty fine fine-tuning argument. But before we get to that, I want to sell you on a couple of things. Here's a strategic card game of logic, reason, and nonsense, and here's a decision matrix. As you can see, the only way to gain infinite utility is by hitch-slapping your friends.
And that is a scientific fact,
Also, in case you're unaware, in an effort to dance with the YouTube gods, I've been publishing some of my slightly off-topic content on another channel, called Casually Debunked. On said channel, I've issued 2 responses to Lucas from Deflate.
Their existence is one big tragedy, the opposite of what God originally intended for them.
2 to John McCrae of What Do You Mean?
The only person who was able to live a perfect life was Jesus, and that's why his sacrifice was so important.
This is bullshit.
A response to Islamic Calling on the problem of evil.
Show me the evidence, show me the evidence, show me the evidence, show me the evidence, show me the evidence.
And most recently, I've given JP Sears a metaphorical slap.
I will unapologetically say that pretending a baby isn't a baby and then killing the baby is not a virtue.
So if you want more of my content, please do check out Casually Debunked. Alrighty, let's talk fine-tuning. There are many different versions of the fine-tuning argument, each referencing the supposed delicacy and precision of differing aspects of our universe. For instance, the laws of nature or the number of dimensions that exist, from which theists emphasize how improbable it would be for such precision to turn up by random chance. However, the most popular version of the argument pertains to the cosmological constant, which more than less is a form of matter or energy that acts in opposition to gravity.
That's 1 in 10 to the 40th precision. I don't have enough faith to believe that that value just landed there by chance.
If we could rewind to the initial state of the Big Bang and ever so slightly turn the dial of the cosmological constant one way, then the universe would have collapsed in on itself. Alternatively, if we ever so slightly would have been able to turn it the other way, then atoms today would be light years apart. And in either case, we have no life at all. Therefore, ergo, alakazam, God did it. On the surface, the fine-tuning argument seems to score very high in the result category. I mean, just look at how precise all these numbers are. Remember, if they were ever so slightly different, you wouldn't be watching this video. But upon reflecting on the world that we see, that is, the numbers that have turned up, it becomes increasingly difficult to square it with the existence of an all-powerful, all-loving deity. Consider, for instance, birth defects or genetic diseases, or the fact that there's been at least 5 mass extinctions in which billions of sentient beings have perished. Are we really to believe that such seemingly gratuitous evil belongs on the resume of Almighty God? The salient point being is that even if the universe is fine-tuned, we have really good reason to think that the fine-tuner, or tuners, are almost certainly not perfect. In terms of intuition, fine-tuning arguments seem to excel. In the absence of knowledge, the state of nature evidently strikes most people as frankly miraculous. Consider the Earth's suspended state in space. Until we figured out that it's not randomly floating in space, people concluded that the Earth must be being held in place by the gods, divine fine-tuners, if you will. Today, however, we figured out that the Earth's position is actually subject to very strict regulations, chiefly general relativity, and so the mystery has been dissolved. But there are still countless areas, such as the aforementioned, where our teleological intuitions remain in full force. So for intuition, I give fine-tuning arguments 5 unnecessarily screaming Frank Turek's out of 7.
So evil is actually an argument for God, not an argument against God.
So what about the refutation category? Have fine-tuning arguments withstood objections? Well, courtesy of the fact that fine-tuning arguments pertain to things completely and utterly out of our knowledge, yes, unsurprisingly, they fare pretty damn well. Despite this, there are some brilliant responses. Alright, let's consider a few objections. Well, the first criticism that comes to mind is what I call the arse-pulling objection. What precisely are the conditions under which life can exist? What even is the definition of life? How the hell are theists so sure that the laws could have been different, and how are they so certain that there's not plenty of ways in which life could have formed? From where did they pull these probabilities from? We know basically nothing about these things, and yet to confidently state that our situation is so unlikely, we'd need to know these facts. Issuing a probability-based argument when we don't know the probabilities is a fool's game. Moving on, as Sean Carroll has expressed, when it comes to fine-tuning arguments, theists tend to severely underestimate God. According to theism, life is not purely physical, and so surely God could create life regardless of physical parameters, no? And remember, this is an all-powerful being we're talking about. To think that he couldn't create life unless atoms are specifically spaced apart, or that there's a precise number of dimensions, strikes me as very implausible. Why couldn't God create life that spans light years, or 5-dimensional life? I don't see contradictions here. No, what I see is an abuse of our flawed intuitions. And then we have alternative explanations. Lawrence Krauss, for instance, suggests that fine-tuning is an illusion. Many things we once thought finely tuned turned out not to be. For instance, Newton thought that the heavens were continuously fine-tuned, by God no less, and then Einstein exposed this illusion. Switching gears, we have the multiverse. There are tons of multiverse models, which we haven't the time to get into, but if there are, or have been, countless universes, that is, if the dice have been rolled countless times, then it's not surprising at all that some of them contain life. And then we've got aliens. Yes, I'm serious. Aliens. Alan Guth suspects that one day we'll be able to create universes, and so perhaps other sentient beings have beat us to it. This hypothesis requires fewer ontological commitments and actually explains the data better than theism, since the aliens are not omnipotent. They're not perfect. Moving on, it's been argued that theism is actually not a good explanation of the supposed fine-tuning we see. Why? Well, under traditional theism, we'd expect the conditions to be very specific, that is, not undertuned nor overtuned. And yet, to give just one example, entropy just after the Big Bang is significantly lower than it needs to be to allow for life. Yeah, under naturalism, we'd expect such facts. Further still, under theism, we'd expect life to play a massive role in the universe, whereas under naturalism, you'd expect life to be pretty much insignificant, and as our telescopes have revealed, life seems to be very insignificant. Carroll illustrated this wonderfully when presenting a photo of hundreds of billions of galaxies, saying the following.
The theistic explanation for cosmological fine-tuning asks you to look at this picture and say, I know why it's like that. It's because I was going to be here, or we were going to be here. But there's nothing in our experience of the universe that justifies the kind of flattering story we like to tell about ourselves.
And then there's my current favourite response, which is as simple as it is eloquent, but it's a little unintuitive and it bends our ego over a barrel. Here it is. We're already well aware that the universe is much, much bigger than what we've observed, and pretty much no astrophysicist believes that the Big Bang was the beginning of everything. So suppose that the universe is monstrously large. So large, in fact, that there are some areas where there are no electrons. In others, it is indeed the case that atoms can't form, and in others still, the cosmological constant is different. Well, if the universe is this diverse, we have a simplistically superior explanation that doesn't require us to, further down the line, buy into all sorts of theodicies and other commitments. On this note, the physicist Leonard Susskind gives a fantastic comparison with liquid water, and I'll just play it.
It's more or less like asking, why do we by accident happen to live on a planet which happens to be at just the right temperature for liquid water to exist? That's a narrow range. Not as narrow, it's not as much of a knife edge as the cosmological constant. Why is that? Well, the answer is very simple. On planets where there can't be water, there can't be life. So it's true, a very small fraction of the planets in the universe are at the right temperature for water to exist. Where do we live? We live in the only place we can live, where water exists. Same kind of picture. Universe very big, very diverse, many different environments, a huge slew of different possibilities. And among these possibilities, in a few small pockets of the universe, conditions are right for life, and that's where life exists.
So, overall, based exclusively on my own conviction, I'd place fine-tuning arguments in either B or C tier. But since so many others find them persuasive, especially intuitively persuasive, I'm happy to bump them to A tier. They are, I freely admit, compelling arguments. Next up, we've got the argument from absurd.
Absurd?
Alright, fine. It's actually called the Kalam Cosmological Argument. I'm sure you've heard of it. Whatever begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. And that cause is conscious, it's a conscious being. And it has libertarian free will. And it's all powerful. And it's all loving. And, well, it's all every attribute that we want. Oh, and there's only one of them, there's only one first cause, not multiple. Are you convinced? You better be, because philosophers take this argument very seriously. Which goes to explain why most of them are not convinced by it. So how's the Kalam perform in the result category? How close, if sound, does it get us to triomni God? Not at all. That's how close. Strictly speaking, the Kalam doesn't even get us to an uncaused cause. However, proponents typically insist that the arguments they offer for the causal premise not only entail at least one uncaused cause, but specifically a singular uncaused cause, and at other times they get to the singular by invoking Occam's razor. So let's treat the argument as if they would establish a singular first uncaused cause. Now then, does the uncaused cause have triomni attributes? Well, in a similar move, some proponents will often argue that the means by which they establish the uncaused cause entails omni attributes, and look, there's no way that I can touch upon each defense here, so I'll have to keep it short. Some defenses seemingly do entail additional attributes, but others not so much. To summarise this segment though, I'd go out on a limb to say that even a large part of the Kalam community will say that these super defences are reaching, and will happily emphasise themselves that the Kalam isn't an argument for God. It just depends on the proponent. What about intuition? If you're intimate with the Kalam, and especially William Lane Craig's various defences of the argument, then you'll know that intuition is to the Kalam what confidently misrepresenting science is to Frank Turek. It's the very engine by which the argument gets going. In defence of Turek though, he's not the only apologist to confidently misrepresent science. Is he, Craig?
In 2003, Arvin Board, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion throughout its history, cannot be infinite in the past, but must have a past space-time boundary. What makes their proof so powerful is that it holds regardless of the physical description of the very early universe. So in fact, the Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theorem does imply an absolute beginning of the universe.
The theorem proves that inflation must have a beginning, right? The universe as a whole, the theorem doesn't say that.
So that means that inflation must have had a beginning. It doesn't really say that the universe must have had a beginning, but it says that the universe could not have been expanding forever up until the present time.
Those clips of authors contradicting Craig's use of their work is from Skydive Field's documentary on the Kalam, in which a boatload of scientists, mathematicians and philosophers respond to numerous statements that Craig has made that pertain to their respective fields. If you're interested in the Kalam, this documentary is a must-watch.
I think one of the basic lessons you can learn from an advanced science of any sort is that common sense and intuition only takes you so far, and beyond a certain point, you really can't trust it.
And better yet, they've just published a second episode. Merry frickin' Christmas.
The onus is really then on Craig to tell us more about what he understands by the metaphysically absurd, and he's going to have to do a lot more than just appeal to intuitions. It's not going to be good enough just to say that there are counterintuitive consequences. Why should the fact that mathematics throws up results with counterintuitive consequences count for anything at all?
But back to the intuition category, I'd give the Kalam a potential infinite out of an actual infinite. Because, despite protestations to the contrary, potential infinites do indeed presuppose actual infinites. So, has the Kalam stood the test of time? Has it adequately dealt with objections? Yes and no. Among philosophers, mathematicians and scientists, those who actually understand set theory, the Kalam performs very poorly, and this is especially true of the historical defences issued by the likes of John Philoponus and Al-Ghazali, which Craig still champions. But there's a really big problem. Unlike the arguments, the objections often work against our intuitions, and thus, despite the paradise which Georg Cantor has created for us, most lay people, let alone theists, still find the historical defences of the Kalam extremely compelling.
It's absurd.
Now, in recent years, other proponents of the Kalam, such as Alex Proust and Robert Koons, have taken a new approach, endorsing various types of dependency finitism, utilising Benedetti paradoxes and whatnot. And it's fair to say that these newer arguments withstand refutation much more effectively than the older arguments. As for whether or not they'll do so for long, because let's face it, they're fresh, only time will tell. But in any case, to think that we can get a triomni god out of any of the proposed defences of the Kalam strikes me, if I'm honest, as almost cringy. If anything is intuitively obvious to me, it's that the Kalam proponents start with their conclusion and work backwards. Without specifying the particular defence of the Kalam, it's quite difficult to issue objections, because the dialectic revolves around how precisely the proponent defends each premise, and unlike other arguments, objections to a Kalam defence are not often applicable to other Kalam defences. Because of this, I'd either have to rank various defences of the Kalam, which perhaps I'll do at another time if you're interested, or I'm going to have to be broad, which is what I'm going to do. If you'd like to see various branches of the dialectic, however, be sure to watch mine and Joe Schmid's series on the Kalam, which next month, I promise, we'll get a fresh instalment.
But, of course, their inference was defeated in January 1667, when the Dutch explorer Willem de Vlaming reported... Why do I have to be the one who says this?
And talking of Joe, he recently published a 12-hour response to 100 Arguments for God's Existence presented by Chad McIntosh and Cameron Bertuzzi, and his sheer brilliance shone throughout. Genuinely, if you want so much food for thought that you'll attain the aesthetics of a generously proportioned medieval monk, then be sure to check out Joe's video. It's brilliant. Anyhow, while addressing the various cosmological arguments, Joe listed 10 things that the uncaused cause could possibly be, all while providing further reading for each candidate.
There are tons of non-theistic views about the intrinsic nature or character of the foundational or fundamental necessarily existing concrete object.
To just list a few, the uncaused first cause, or better yet, the necessary being, could be a collection of physical symbols like quarks or superstrings. It could be a fundamental or foundational quantum field, or perhaps a universal wave function, or it might be the universe as a whole in and of itself. The point being, of course, is that there's tons of candidate uncaused causes, and since most of them are simpler than a triomni god, they come with a lighter ontological baggage. That is, they require us to make fewer commitments, and still give us the same explanatory value.
When you've got two theories that are competing to explain the same data, the way that you make the choice is by looking to see which of the theories does best at doing two things simultaneously, minimizing its commitments, so that is being as simple as it can be, and maximizing explanation, explaining as much as it can.
Now, stage 2 considerations of the Kalam, that is, arguments and reasons for identifying the uncaused cause with triomni God, are on significantly shakier ground than the arguments in favour of the causal principle. Indeed, there's a very good reason why apologists don't tend to spend too much time on stage 2. Anyhow, we've got to wrap this up. Let's get to the big question. Which tier is the Kalam going in? Well, I think it's either a very good argument or set of arguments for an uncaused cause, but in which case it's a terrible argument for God, since again there's a buttload of better candidates, and the specific arguments that get us to God are not very good, or it's just a terrible argument for God. Despite this, I'm going to grant it B status, chiefly because 1, it's the go-to for every theist that can read Wikipedia, and 2, because, to be fair, there is some really interesting and insightful philosophy surrounding it currently in the literature. Let's talk contingency and necessity, because doing so is a great way to lose friends and alienate people. There are many types of contingency-based arguments, but the most prevalent, at least as of this moment, follow in the footsteps of Gottfried Leibniz by employing what's known as a principle of sufficient reason, or PSR. A common PSR states that everything that exists has a reason, cause, or ground for its existence, either in a contingent being, that is, a thing, event, or state of affairs that might have failed to exist, or in a necessary being, that is, a thing, event, or state of affairs that could not have failed to exist. It exists in all possible worlds. Yeah, contingency arguments are a little inaccessible to the broader public, which, as far as some apologists are concerned, is a feature.
I'm telling you, within 3 days...
Oh, here he comes. Switch to big words.
Within a triad of solar periods, you'll recognize your dearth of compatibility with your paramour and conclude your association.
If we put up a middle finger to Spinoza and assume that this patron-exclusive tankard is a contingent being, we can ask why it exists, and get to a sufficient reason. This tankard exists because I want to entice potential patronage with goodies. Likewise, we can ask, why do I want to entice patronage, which again is a contingent affair, and will arrive at a sufficient reason. To cut to the chase, it seems that each individual contingent being can be explained, but what about the totality of contingent beings? If we took every contingent being and put them into a set, how do we explain the set itself? Well, we can't refer to another contingent being, can we, since doing so would render the set of contingent beings as a member of itself. Given this, the only other option, so proponents say, is a necessary being, and as Aquinas says, by this necessary being, we mean God. Let's give a sufficient reason for where we rank contingency arguments in the result category, shall we? Well, despite apologists providing little to no sufficient reason for identifying the necessary being as God, the only thing that contingency arguments substantiate, if indeed they substantiate anything at all, is that a necessary being exists. That is, there exists at least one entity that could not have failed to exist. Thus, just like the Kalam, contingency arguments are compatible with basically any worldview. Now, proponents tend to argue that necessity is an attribute of God, and so the argument gets us a step closer to him. But as the renowned Christian Richard Swinburne, among others, has expressed, this just isn't true. As Christopher Hitchens might have put it, even if we establish a necessary being, the theist still has all of their work still ahead of them. Are contingency arguments intuitive? That is the question. No, they're not. Not only is the language clunky and somewhat inaccessible, but the very notion of something that can explain itself is not intuitive at all. If you asked me, why did you make this video? And I replied, oh, it's because I made this video. In fact, there's no world in which I didn't make this video. In response, you're likely to intuit that I either didn't understand your question or I've eaten all of the marijuana. What about refutation? How do contingency arguments hold up? Pretty damn good. It turns out that if your arguments pivot on things we know basically nothing about, then, by virtue of our lack of knowledge, your arguments are likely safe from refutation. And yes, this will provide the illusion that your arguments are frickin' dope. That said, here's a few objections that come to mind. Let's suppose that there's at least one necessary being. Here's the next question. Why is there a set of necessary beings rather than no set? How do we explain the existence of the set? Notice that we can't explain the set in terms of necessity, since doing so would render the set as a member of itself, which is precisely the reason proponents dismiss others when they suggest that the set of contingent beings is contingent. So again, why is there a set of necessary beings rather than no set? The point being is that in the end we're going to have to buy a brute fact, we're going to have to say that something just exists, and that's it. All roads lead to Russell. And so, if we're going to bite such a horrendous bullet in any case, it can be argued that, since a necessary being is going to give way to a brute fact almost instantly, we have every reason to avoid also biting the bullet of a necessary being. Now, to be clear, there's plenty of really interesting arguments in favour of a necessary being, and there's certainly room for rational disagreement. But as of this moment, my agnosticism leans against it. As already said in reference to the Kalam Cosmological argument, contingency arguments don't typically get us anywhere near a triomni God. And I say typically because some proponents argue that the means by which they establish a necessary being also entails that that being is equipped with omni attributes. But likewise to the Kalam, I find pretty much all of these stage 2 arguments to be significantly weaker than the stage 1s. But yeah, for the reasons just covered in the result category just a moment ago, when it comes to God, contingency arguments are somewhat trivial. There's a boatload of candidates for the necessary being, and they come with fewer commitments and arguably greater explanatory depth. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that they just have better explanatory depth. They don't have all these damn problems of trying to explain evil. The last objection I'll raise in this terse tier list relates to the greatest of all time, David Hume. While theists tend to be quick to dismiss Hume's accusation of contingency arguments committing a composition fallacy, likewise to Bertrand Russell, I think that Hume's objection remains. Even if every contingent being has a reason, cause, or ground for its existence, it just doesn't follow that the collection of contingent beings has a reason, cause, or ground for its existence. Russell likened this to concluding that the human race has a mother since every individual human has a mother. It just doesn't follow. Now, fine. It could be the case that the collection has a reason, cause, or ground, as, after all, it's true that if every brick in a wall is red, then the wall itself is red. But, to the contrary, it's false to say that if every brick in the wall is small, then the wall itself is small. The crux is that the proponent has a lot of work to do here, and by my lights at least, Hume's objection remains intact. But the big question is, what tier is the contingency argument? Similar to the Kalam, I think it's either a very good argument for a necessary being, a being without a reason, cause, or ground, but in which case it's a terrible argument for God, since again there's a buttload of better candidates, or it's just a convoluted and pretty bad argument for God. So, in a likely controversial move, I'm going to stick it in B tier. In terms of argumentation, I think that contingency arguments wipe the floor with Kalam arguments, but Kalam arguments wipe the floor with contingency arguments when it comes to intuition. And in my experience, apologetics and intuition go hand in hand. It's time, my dudes, to talk about perhaps the most intuitive argument of them all, the Watchmaker analogy. The The Watchmaker analogy is an argument for God's existence that states, by way of analogy, that design implies a designer, and while versions of it have existed since at least the time of Cicero, it was most compellingly presented in 1802 by William Paley. In a nutshell, proponents argue that just as the complexity of a watch implies an intelligent designer, that is, a watchmaker, the complexity of the universe, or specifically life, implies an intelligent designer, that is, God. The argument is short, simple, and straight to the point. So how's Paley doing in the result category? Well, if sound, the argument would clearly establish that there was at least one intelligent designer, but that's about it. It wouldn't even solidify that the designer or designers still exist, let alone that it or they have any of the triomni attributes. Also, as Darwin and many others have observed, much of the universe cries out that it definitely wasn't designed by an all-powerful, all-loving being. To give just one example, consider the reproductive system of many wasps. One species, for instance, injects eggs into its victim, and then over weeks the larvae eat the victim from the inside out. I would show you some images, but I can't, I'll get demonetized. Thanks God. Anyhow, having evolved to carefully avoid vital organs, they prolong the process. So yeah, theists like to refer to the beauty of the trees and the birds, but they've also got to account for the nightmare fuel of parasites and Frank Turek. Moving on to intuition, this is where the argument completely dominates. Our brains have evolved to see patterns and designs even when they're not there, enter pareidolia, and teleological arguments ride this evolved software into the sunset. Put it this way, despite the watchmaker analogy having been refuted on numerous fronts even before Darwin came along, the sheer number of brilliant minds that wholeheartedly endorse the analogy is staggering. The list includes Sir Isaac Newton, René Descartes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Cicero, and Voltaire. And even to this day, in the age of information, the analogy still remains firmly on the average theist's list of favourite arguments. So I'm going to unapologetically give the watchmaker analogy 13 parasitic wasp larvae out of 1 Frank Turek. A perfect score. Here's a question. Has the watchmaker analogy withstood refutation? No, it hasn't. Before Paley had even published his book, Hume had already shattered the analogy, offering a number of excellent refutations, which we'll delve into in just a moment. Another brilliant person to have seen through the intuitive illusion was Percy Bysshe Shelley, who I would argue is one of the most undervalued heroes in the history of atheism. His writing speaks to my soul, so to speak. It's utterly, enthrallingly brilliant. And then, of course, Darwin came along and changed how we see the universe forever. So let's just dive into some of the objections, shall we? One of Hume's objections tackled the analogical form of the argument itself. The argument concludes that since a watch is similar to the universe or life in one respect, that is, they're both complex, they must be similar in another respect, that is, they must be the product of intelligent design. But Hume emphasised that for the analogy to succeed, the two things being compared must have a sufficient number of similarities relevant to what's being compared. To illustrate his point, he gave the example of a kitten and a lion, highlighting that it would be wrong to conclude that the kitten can roar from the fact that the lion can roar. Likewise, it's not clear at all that watches and the universe or life share a sufficient number of similarities relevant to what's being compared. I mean, for one thing, watches don't bump uglies, do they? Another one of Hume's objections is that we have no experience of world making, of universe making. When it comes to watches, or indeed anything we claim to know the cause of, we reason based on our previous experiences with either the object or phenomenon itself, or similar objects or phenomena. For instance, we know that the watch is the product of intelligent design because we have observed millions of watches being created by intelligent designers, and none being created without intelligent input. However, when it comes to the universe, or universes, we have no experience of how they were created. None. Hence, it's illogical to infer that the universe has been created by intelligent design based on our observations of human-crafted objects. It's like arguing that the universe roars based on the fact that lions roar. As mentioned in the result category, the watchmaker analogy doesn't really get us anywhere near a singular god, let alone one of triomni quality. Hume, again, emphasised this, finding it amusing that theists tend to jump straight to the singular, and even their very specific god, when, if they take their analogy to its conclusion, they'd more likely land in a bizarre ground of polytheism. Watches are usually designed by a team of people, right? Not just one person. It's almost as if theists are picking the attributes they want and ignoring the others. Here's another angle. Watches are typically the result of numerous trials and errors, with each rendition being an improvement on the previous, and this would make sense of the mass extinctions that we've seen on Earth. But, of course, it doesn't make sense under the rubric of a triumphant God. An all-powerful God doesn't need trials, it's perfect. Lastly, let's touch upon one of the most compelling rebutting defeaters of all time, the origin of species. As we're all aware, the publication of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection provided a superior explanation to the watchmaker analogy, not only accounting for the data in Darwin's time, but also the subsequent data of today. We are the product of evolution by natural selection, and our flawed and fallacious thinking is but one demonstration of this. Going back to Shelley, and just to give the man a bit more love, here's a few incredible words, and I really do mean incredible words, that he wrote long before the origin of species. That certain animals exist in certain climates results from the consanguinity of their frames to the circumstances of their situation. Let these circumstances be altered to a sufficient degree, and the elements of their composition must exist in some new combination, no less resulting than the former from those inevitable laws by which the universe is governed. Yeah, that's a bish anticipating natural selection. Genius. Absolute genius. But where are we going to put the watchmaker analogy on our list? Straight up, it's S tier, through and through. It's a phenomenal argument that, despite facing completely and utterly overwhelming refutation, still remains one of the most popular arguments for God's existence. Historically, it convinced countless extremely brilliant people, and with a few tweaks, such as putting the emphasis on abiogenesis or even the genetic code, or what have you, it's going to continue to convince extremely brilliant people. As far as I'm concerned, it's by far the best argument that theists have ever had. It's brilliant. Speaking of the argument from genetic information, let's delve into it, shall we? It's a favourite among the intelligent design community, being heralded by the likes of Ken Ham, John Lennox and Cy Gart. Unfortunately, this argument is complicated by the fact that there are two very different things that might be meant when a textbook talks about an organism's genetic code. First, there's this chart, which outlines the rules of the standard genetic code. That is, the rules that the ribosome follow when reading a gene and using it to build a specific protein. The standard genetic code was cracked by scientists in the 1960s, and, with very few exceptions, is identical in all organisms known to science. Almost all organisms use the same genetic code. Second, some textbooks also refer to an organism's specific DNA sequence as its genetic code. A chain of DNA is made of 4 different types of molecule building blocks, which scientists have labelled A, C, T, and G. These building blocks can be arranged in any sequence along the length of a chain of DNA. The specific DNA sequence in your cells is billions of building blocks long, and geneticists do not usually refer to your sequence as your genetic code. Instead, they call it your genome. Ken Ham and John Lennox conflate the genetic code and the genome in pretty much all of their arguments. Cy Gart, however, doesn't. Anyhow, let's consider Lennox's version of the argument from DNA. If you were to see 3 or 4 letters of your name written on, say, a beach, you'd immediately infer intelligent design, wouldn't you? Indeed, it wouldn't even cross your mind that random waves or wind might have written it. That's just silly. Thus, language only comes from intelligent design. There's the crucial premise. And guess what? Within your body, there's a language of life, the human genome, and it consists of 3 billion letters in precisely the right order, as Lennox likes to say.
In exactly the right order.
And look, you've just admitted that you'd infer intelligence from a mere 4 letters. So surely it's obvious that an intelligent designer wrote the 3 billion letters in your genome, no? Is it just me, or are you getting a feeling of déjà vu?
Oh, déjà vu.
What did you just say?
So how's the argument from genetic information fare in the result category? How close, if sound, would it affirm triomni God? Well, it would do so pretty much to the same degree as the watchmaker analogy. That is, it wouldn't get us to a singular intelligent designer, nor give us reason to suspect that the designer or designers still exist, and the conjunction of the way the world actually is, the existence of the likes of parasites and cancer, and the extinction of millions of failed genomes, would strongly indicate that the craftsman definitely isn't all-loving and all-powerful. Again, an all-powerful God doesn't make mistakes. Once again, similar to the watchmaker analogy. Funny that, ain't it? The argument from genetic information scores pretty high in the intuition category, since just as we intuitively associate complexity with intelligent design, so too we intuitively associate language with intelligent design. But unlike the watchmaker analogy, far fewer brilliant minds have been seduced by the genetic code argument. Why? Well, to start, while scientists have assigned letters to the 4 types of DNA building blocks, DNA itself doesn't literally have letters. It is a chain of physical molecules. That said, the thing we call the genetic code really does show us the rules used in a genuine signaling system. You could call this a language, the language used between genes and ribosomes inside our cells. If we grant that this is a language, it is worth noting though that compared to English, the genetic code is an incredibly simple language. This tiny chart represents its entire dictionary. The existence of a language, even a simple one, does require explanation. But haven't we learnt from our predecessors that tucking God into the gaps of our knowledge isn't really the brightest move? As we'll get to in just a moment, we're already quite aware of how DNA sequences evolve, and scientists also understand, in principle, how signaling systems, that is languages, evolve. The existence of genetic information is not quite the mystery that biological complexity was in Paley's time. Alright, how's the argument from genetic information perform in terms of refutation? Broadly worse than the watchmaker argument, but in a few areas better. To get to the heart of the argument, whereas the watchmaker analogy insists that complexity only comes from intelligent design, the argument from genetic information insists that language only comes from intelligent design. But as is likely obvious to everyone watching, with very few tweaks, most objections relevant to the watchmaker argument likewise strike the genetic information argument, and given that we've just covered the former, I'm going to blitz through this. That said, a year back I had the great fortune of collaborating with the amazing John Perry of Stated Clearly and Stated Casually, in which we addressed the argument from genetic information from multiple angles. So needless to say, for a more in-depth response, please be sure to check out that video. Likewise to the watchmaker argument, the genetic information argument suffers from many of the same issues. As covered in the result category, the argument 1 doesn't suggest a triomni god, courtesy of so many seemingly obvious errors and mistakes, and of course the extinction of countless failed genomes. 2, it doesn't indicate that the designer or designers are still alive. In fact, since every human language was designed by finite beings, proponents ought to equally infer that the genetic code was written by finite beings. And 3, the analogy that Lennox uses is clumsy. DNA building blocks are not letters. Instead, they are physical molecules that have been assigned letters by human scientists. That said, when a ribosome is reading a gene and using it to build a protein, each set of 3 nucleotides in a gene sequence really do function as a symbol, telling it which amino acid to add to the protein that it's building. As Perry put it in our collaboration, we're quite aware of how new signaling systems or new languages evolve. Languages can emerge through co-evolution. Take flowers for instance. Flowers that biotically pollinate send signals to receivers, and those signals consist of enhanced colours, shapes and fragrances, which communicate to the receivers such as bees and other pollinators that they have yummy resources. Now, did an intelligent designer write those signals? No. Flowers and pollinators have been driving each other's evolution for at least 100 million years. Flowers that could better signal to pollinators had an advantage, and, likewise, pollinators that could better receive the signals from flowers had an advantage, meaning that these flowers and pollinators could reproduce more successfully and proliferate. And the same is true of the signals of birds audibly communicating with one another, and parts of the body biologically communicating with other parts, such as my balls secreting hormones to tell my face to grow a beard.
That's disgusting.
Current models about the origin of the genetic code have it emerging as ribosomal genes co-evolve with protein coding genes. Now, sure, we don't currently know every detail about how the genetic code first emerged, just as we're not sure more broadly on how life first emerged. But as John Adams succinctly put it, mystery is a convenient cover for absurdity. Right then, I don't know about you, but I'm done with this knockoff pocket watch, and so let's stick it in the tier list already. I'm going to plant the genetic code argument in C tier. While it outperforms the watchmaker analogy in terms of sophistication and, ironically, complexity, requiring interlocutors to understand a bit of genetics, In pretty much every other area, it can't hold a light to Paley. Are you ready for another attempt to prove God's existence from an armchair, a priori? Well then, let's discuss Anselm's ontological argument. Imagine the greatest conceivable being and call it God. He's all-powerful, all-loving, and all-delicious. But here's a question. Does he actually exist, or is he a figment of your imagination? Well, if he's just a figment of your imagination, then we can conceive of a greater being, namely the same being but with the additional property of existence. Hence, the greatest possible being must exist, as if it didn't, it wouldn't be the greatest possible being, would it? Yep, as Anselm said himself, only the fool could deny such intellectual prowess. How close, if sound, would Anselm's ontological argument get us to triumny God? Well, as Immanuel Kant expressed, pretty much all the way. It ranks extremely high in this category. The greatest conceivable being is going to entail triumny attributes, or at the very least, maximal attributes. And, you know, I don't think there's anything else to say on this front. If the tier list was decided by this category alone, Anselm would firmly sit at the very top of S tier. What about intuition? Is Anselm's ontological argument instinctively easy to understand? Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that plenty of people seemingly intuit that existence is a perfection, and thus the greatest conceivable being must have this perfection. But no, in the sense that, as Bertrand Russell noted, pretty much everyone immediately intuits that there's something wrong with the argument, that there's something that just doesn't add up right. So, how effectively has Anselm's ontological argument withstood refutation over the centuries? Well, put it this way. If you ever want to see theists, atheists, and agnostics breaking bread, then look no further. From Guanilo to Aquinas to Kant to Hume, everyone and their dog has issued objections at the argument. Let's just scratch the bare surface. My favourite response is the first response that Anselm received, which came from a monk called Guanilo, or Ganilo, or whatever. To be honest with you, I don't think that any of us really know how to pronounce his name. Anyhow, employing the same logical form as Anselm, Guanilo proved the existence of the perfect island, since, per Anselm's reasoning, the perfect island must have all perfections, and existence is a perfection. If the island doesn't have the perfection of existence, then, obviously, it isn't the perfect island, is it? Anselm responded by saying that his argument only applies to concepts that have necessary existence, and this led to my favourite corollary, the devil corollary. Imagine the greatest conceivable evil being. He necessarily exists, is more powerful than any other being, and wait a minute. All of a sudden the forest fires and the turret cruises make a lot more sense, don't they?
Everything I say is a lie.
Another prominent objection came from Aquinas, which, needless to say, led to subsequent Catholic theologians tending to reject the argument. As far as Aquinas was convinced, God is incomprehensible, well, for everyone other than God. Try as we might, we actually can't conceive of God. It's not possible. His power level is over 9,000, don't you know? So when Anselm asks us to conceive of the greatest possible being, we simply can't. If Aquinas is right, then the argument is dead from the get-go. As Kenneth Heimer and others have objected, perhaps the very notion of a triumny being is incoherent or contradictory. An example Heimer gives is that omnipotence implies that God can create agents with libertarian free will, and yet omniscience implies that God knows precisely what libertarian agents are going to do. Arguably, this is incoherent. Or to focus on the all-loving attribute, it seems that an all-loving God must enact justice, but also mercy. The problem, though, is that mercy is by definition the suspension of justice. Now, there's a lot of back and forth in the literature when it comes to the incoherence objection, and this ain't the place to get into the thick of it. But if the traditional view of God is incoherent, then the fool is the one who's convinced himself otherwise. Let's turn our attention to the most famous objection to ontological arguments, offered by no other than Kant in his Critique of Pure Reason. Technically, Kant issued this objection at Descartes' version, but as William Rowe and others have emphasised, this applies to Anselm's version as well. Existence is not, my fellow apes, a predicate. That is, existence isn't a property or quality. Put it this way.
A few inches later.
Put it this way, what's greater? This debunk card game, which has the properties of being made of cardboard and coated in linen, or this debunk card game, which has the properties of being made of cardboard, coated in linen, and existing? Yeah. Me adding the word existence doesn't do anything to the concept, does it? So existence isn't a predicate, and since Anselm's ontological argument only works if existence is a predicate, the argument is invalidated. Now there's some really interesting back and forth to be had here, but this isn't of course the time to do so. And to approach this from just one more angle, Rowe and others have objected on the ground that Anselm's ontological argument begs the question. That is, it assumes the very thing it's attempting to prove. To illustrate this, Rowe gave the example of a magician, which he defined as an existing magician. Now, if I was aiming to prove that Merlin exists, and as a premise I said that Merlin is a magician, then it's good game, I win. Because look, if you conceive of a magician, then by definition you must be conceiving of a magician that exists. Hence, Merlin exists. In his paper titled The Ontological Argument and Question Begging, Rowe expressed this point forcefully. Since Anselm's concept of God logically cannot apply to some non-existing thing, the only possible objects to which it could apply are possible objects which actually exist. Therefore, in granting that Anselm's God is a possible thing, we are granting far more than the idea that God isn't incoherent or contradictory. Or as Rowe goes on to say, in granting that Anselm's God is a possible thing, we are in fact granting that Anselm's God actually exists. But since the purpose of the argument is to prove to us that Anselm's God exists, we cannot be asked to grant as a premise a statement which is virtually equivalent to the conclusion that is to be proved. So where does, according to me, Anselm's ontological argument land in the tier list? I'd say it's just about, and I do mean just about, D tier. While pretty much everyone can smell that there's something wrong with the argument, and there's been tons of extremely compelling responses, the sheer amount of literature that it spawned is awe-inspiring. Also, I share Kant's view that the ontological argument is the only argument that would really get us to God. Like no other, it is genuinely the pathway to the Almighty. Now, if you think that ontological arguments have a stench of bovine waste, then hold your noses, because you're about to endure more bullshit than the average attendee at a Turek lecture.
Ladies, why don't you just take the knife, stick it in, and turn it?
In philosophy, a possible world is a state, a world, in which things could have been. For instance, if we again stick a middle finger up at Spinoza, there's a possible world in which you didn't watch this video. Now to cut straight to the chase, we can ask, what's greater, a being that could have failed to exist, or a being that could not have failed to exist? Alvin Plantinga and others have argued that the possibility to have failed to exist is a flaw, and thus, since the greatest conceivable being has no flaws, if it exists, then there is no possible world in which it doesn't exist. So far, we're in the same ballpark as before. However, the modal ontological argument utilizes an axiom known as S5, or a system known as S5, which states that if something is possibly necessary, then it's necessary. So, in the context of this argument, if it's possible that the greatest conceivable being exists, then it exists in all possible worlds, including the actual world, this world.
That's a lot of bullshit.
Given this, the theist can ask the atheist or agnostic a seemingly humble question. Hey, do you think there's any chance that God exists? Like, surely you think there's a 1 in a billion, no? You're not that close-minded, are you? To which the average atheist or agnostic, who's unaware of the dialectical moves, will likely answer yes, there's a chance that God exists. But then the theist, or more accurately the apologist, with a shit grin from ear to ear, will cry checkmate, because if there's any chance that God exists, that is, if God as a necessary being exists in any possible world, then per S5 he must exist in all possible worlds, including the actual world.
That's some bullshit!
Likewise to Anselm's ontological argument, the modal ontological argument scores extremely high in the result category, and for all the same reasons. Again, an ontological argument, if sound, is going to get us all the way to traditional theism. But is the modal ontological argument intuitive? Well, I think it's certainly got a couple of chips in its favour. For instance, possible world semantics is so intuitive that most people utilise this heuristic on a daily basis. And once one wraps their head around S5, I think that most find it intuitively plausible. But then there's certainly chips against our intuition. Again, as Russell noted, pretty much everyone immediately intuits that there's something seriously wrong with the argument. I mean, just put it this way. The argument effectively forces the burden of proof onto detractors, which is very suspect, and it does so with almost comical force. Detractors are expected to not only give reasons against the existence of God, but to 100% prove that God doesn't exist. Now, if that doesn't rock your intuition radar, then God help you. How's the modal ontological argument perform in terms of refutation? One of the features of the modal ontological argument is that it takes a bit of work to really understand the argument. In order to offer a refutation, one needs to have an adequate comprehension of rules of inference, epistemic versus ontological possibility, and foundational axioms, which, let's face it, most people don't. This effort would be worth it, though, if lots of theists championed the modal ontological argument. But they don't. As Plantinga himself said, very few have been brought to believe in God by means of this argument. Despite this, however, there's been some great responses, and here's just a few. To the surprise of no one, many of the objections relevant to Anselm's ontological argument equally hit, or with very few tweaks equally hit, the modal ontological argument. For instance, as Rowe emphasised, if a triomni God is incoherent, then a triomni God that also necessarily exists is incoherent. Rowe gave the comparison of a unicorn X, which is a unicorn that actually exists. Obviously, if unicorns don't exist, then neither can unicorn X's, since the latter is a subset of the former. If God is incomprehensible or incoherent, then the argument fails from the very first hurdle. If my tier list had a sophistry category, then the modal ontological argument would take bronze, silver, gold, and that exotic cruise with Turek. As already discussed, given the axiom of S5, the argument paints detractors to appear extremely arrogant, since in order to reject the argument, they're going to have to say that there is no chance that God exists. To which the apologists will respond, "What? No chance at all? Really? Zero? You see, my flock, the arrogance of the atheist stands naked before you."
What you help the atheist to see is the intellectual price tag of his atheism.
But if the atheist or agnostic were so inclined, they could be equally as cantankerous and insufferable by providing a reverse ontological argument. For instance, we could say, "Humble theist, do you think there's any chance that God doesn't exist? Say 1 in a billion quadrillion chance that he doesn't exist." And of course, since most theists don't have the disease of presuppositionalism, most theists will answer in the affirmative. But then it's good game, ain't it? We win. Why? Because per S5, if there's a possible world in which a necessary being doesn't exist, then in all possible worlds, including the actual world, a necessary being doesn't exist. It's all or nothing. Either God exists in all possible worlds, or none.
That's a lot of bullshit.
Or to give one more example, consider gratuitous evil. That is, suffering that God could have prevented without losing some greater good or permitting some equal or worse evil. When you, dear theist, watch children die of cancer and acknowledge the immense suffering imbued in the very process, the very fabric of evolution, surely you admit that there's at least a chance that these evils are gratuitous, say 0.1% chance. Well, if we then add, very plausibly, that if gratuitous evil exists, then God doesn't exist, then, per S5, God definitely doesn't exist. And if the theist won't grant the possibility of gratuitous evil, then damn, bro, you're so close-minded. This is the intellectual price tag of theism. From here, the conversation dives into proposed symmetry breakers, which is for another time. So which tier does the modal ontological argument belong to? Well, I'm really not a fan. The argument, or more accurately its proponents, almost always embody everything I hate about apologetics. It's very rare to meet a theist who uses the argument in good faith. When they see their interlocutor struggling to grasp, say, the difference between epistemic and ontological possibility, rather than teaching them, proponents tend to dance around in victory. It's just so obviously not about truth for them, it's about winning. This, coupled with the more important fact that everyone immediately intuits that something is suspect, and that basically no one becomes convinced of God based on the argument, I'm not going to stick it in my tier list at all.
But why? Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
Or I should say, it doesn't land anywhere between S and D. It's either E or F, as far as I'm convinced. But if it doesn't make my list, then why have I even given it the time of day? We can, if we like, instead take a page out of Kant's book and point out that existence is not a predicate. Existence is not an attribute, but rather that which attributes apply to. And in doing so, we can reject premise 2.
In his remaining clip, he says existence is not a property. It's not a great-making property. And contemporary versions of the ontological argument don't assume that existence is a property. It just asks whether it's possible that there be a being that answers to this concept of maximal greatness. And certainly to exist in every possible world is greater than to just exist in some but not all worlds. And so even if existence is not a property, it doesn't have any effect upon Plantinga's formulation of the argument.
As just seen, a while back, Cameron Bertuzzi had Craig respond to my tongue-in-cheek treatment of Anselm's ontological argument, and Craig quite absurdly applied my objections, well, Guanalo's and Kant's objections, to the modal ontological argument, and then dismissed me as dealing with a weaker version. Yeah, it's a bit weird. But I thought, bugger it, I'll add the modal ontological argument to my list. That way I can avoid being accused of going for the weaker version. And yes, I know what you're thinking, I will indeed have to create another video when Craig applies my objections here to another ontological argument. But, well, that's just how this goes, I guess. Some people think that if there is no God, then there are no objective moral values and duties, and this thought is captured neatly in various moral arguments for God's existence. Otherwise known as arguments from morality, this line of reasoning can be found in the writings of Immanuel Kant and C.S. Lewis, with the latter insisting that conscience reveals to us a moral law whose source cannot be found in the natural world, thus pointing to a supernatural lawgiver. But the most prominent formulation of the argument, at least today, is surely Craig's. Craig says that the bad news is 1. If God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But the good news is 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist, and therefore we know that God exists. How close would the moral argument get us to try only God if it were sound? Well, trivially, it would get us to at least one God, but that's just about it. It could be that morality is upheld by one God, while other gods instantiate or regulate other substrates of nature. Or it could be that a very powerful and loving, but not all-powerful and all-loving God is responsible for our supposed moral values and duties. It seems clear, then, that the moral argument would only get us so far. We'd have quite the work still in front of us to get to try on the super groovy, mega delicious God. No doubt, the moral argument relies very heavily on intuition. By far the most prominent ways that proponents defend the second premise is through 1. Revelation, which in this context is begging the question, and 2. Intuition. You very likely intuit, for instance, that killing innocent babies is wrong. In fact, I'd bet that your intuition screams this, which is a bit awkward when we think of the innocent baby slowly drowning in Noah's flood. Despite this, proponents argue that God is the best explanation for our moral intuition, since he's written on our heart what's right and wrong. How has the moral argument withstood refutation over the years? Is it standing strong? No. Tons of non-theists reject the first premise, maintaining that objective moral values exist, and are better explained by non-theistic propositions, whereas tons of other non-theists reject the second premise, rejecting that objective moral values exist outright. Let's briefly expand upon each of these responses, and then maybe talk a little bit about Euthyphro. Shall we? The most prominent response to the moral argument is to reject the first premise. According to the 2020 Phil Papers survey, which gathered the views of 7,685 philosophers across predominantly the United States and Europe, 67% of philosophers are self-described atheists, and 62% of philosophers affirm moral realism. And we can gather from these stats that quite a lot of atheist philosophers believe in objective morality. On consequential and deontological grounds alone, there's tons of literature that the proponent of the moral argument is going to have to give us reason to dismiss. And rarely, if ever, do they even attempt to do this. No, Rather, they rely on supposed revelation in scripture, and, of course, intuition to get us to affirm their specific view. Now, expanding on the various moral realist positions and arguments here would be inappropriate, but if any of these alternative moral realist views are true, which in most cases make far fewer assumptions than theism and for the same or greater explanatory depth, then moral arguments for God's existence fail. Another popular response to the argument is, of course, to reject the second premise, that is, to say that there are no objective moral values. Well, we could take the anti-realist position and simply state, no, objective moral values and duties do not exist, and in doing so reject premise 2. Get over it, bucko. Or, if you believe that morality is objective, you can do this.
Okay, let's hold it here. Here we got the get over it objection again. Just adopt moral nihilism. That's all right. Just say there are no objective moral values and duties. There's nothing really immoral about murdering and raping a little girl.
Well, despite Craig's flabbergasted response to me, he knows, I'm certain, that there are plenty of excellent philosophers who reject moral realism. In fact, according to the aforementioned survey, over a quarter of philosophers affirm moral anti-realism, and a further 12% are ambiguous. Moral anti-realism isn't this out-there response, it's well respected in the literature. Now, proponents of moral arguments such as Craig tend to respond to anti-realist arguments by appealing to our intuition, as we just saw, by emphasising that we intuit very strongly that torturing a child is morally wrong. And again, they do this despite the fact that they believe that their God tortured and or killed children in Noah's Ark and, say, Exodus 11:4-5. Once again, expanding on the various arguments in favour of moral anti-realism here wouldn't be appropriate, but if you'd like to see some of the objections issued to how Craig defends the second premise of his moral argument, then be sure to watch my video titled The Moral Collapse of William Lane Craig. Lastly, an oblique way to approach arguments from morality is through the Euthyphro dilemma. Put simply, we can ask, why is rape morally wrong? That is, does God have a reason for commanding what he commands? To take one horn of the dilemma, if it's morally wrong simply because God commands it, then morality is completely arbitrary, and so the second premise is false. If God had commanded us to rape, then doing so would be morally right. We'd have a duty, in fact, to do so. And to take the second horn, if God commands us not to rape because it's morally wrong, then, well, morality exists independent of God, and thus the first premise is false. Now, there's a vast amount of literature on this topic, but to cut to the current most popular response, some theists claim that this is a false dilemma, stating that God's very nature is the standard for value.
Now, the problem for the skeptic is this is not a true dilemma. This is what we call a false dilemma. And God doesn't arbitrarily make up a standard. God is the standard. That's the third option. The buck has to stop somewhere, and it stops with God. So he's not looking beyond him. He's not inventing a moral standard. He is what we call justice, righteousness, and goodness. He is the standard.
But this is merely kicking the can down the road, since the dilemma can be rephrased to, is God good because what he aligns with is some goodness that is already present, or is he good because he defines what good is by his existence? If he's good because he aligns with some goodness, then, well, goodness is obviously independent. Whereas if he defines what is good, then morality is arbitrary.
He is what we call justice, righteousness, and goodness. He is the standard.
Yep, so when God drowns innocent babies, that's good. Take that, you filthy skeptics. You just... some 3D chess going on here. Now then... where do I place the moral argument on my tier list? You know, if I was to base this on what I personally think of the argument, I'd probably put it in F tier. But likewise to Pascal's wager and Paley's Watchmaker, the moral argument performs pretty damn well among general theists, and so I'm willing to bump it to D tier. I think that's fair. D tier is where the moral argument goes. Finally, let's consider arguments from personal experience. There are various types of arguments from personal experience, but the most relevant to this tier list are those of personal revelation, that is, a direct experience of God's presence that strikes as real as anything possibly could. Sometimes these revelations are a feeling, other times an inspiration, and still others a vision, perhaps involving an interaction. By their very nature, personal experiences cannot be shared, and while they're never presented formally, if they were, they'd go something like this. Premise 1. I've had a personal experience of God, therefore God exists. Or, if we want to tease out suppressed premises, proponents might want to say that their senses and experiences are infallible, at least under certain conditions. Let's hear an example of a personal experience of God.
To make a long story short, I went through about 6 months of the most intense soul searching that I've ever been through. And at the end of those 6 months, I just came to the end of my rope and cried out to God one night. And as I cried out all the anger and the bitterness that was in me, I felt this tremendous infusion of joy, like a balloon being blown up until it was ready to burst. And I remember I rushed outside. It was a warm September Midwestern evening. And as I looked up at the sky, I could see the Milky Way from horizon to horizon. And I looked up at the stars and I thought, God, I've come to know God. And that moment just changed my whole life. And I think that the witness of the Holy Spirit is entirely adequate to both justify and warrant the knowledge that Christianity is true.
Now, you might not expect this type of argument or appeal from the lofty likes of Craig, but honestly, if you delve into apologetics, and perhaps even most theistic philosophers, the philosophy really does seem to come third. It goes geography, personal experience, and only then philosophy. Personal experience is evidently a hell of a trip. Also, it's worth noting that Craig believes that Christianity is worth believing even if it's just got a 1 in a million chance of being true, and so the task of getting him to write off his personal experience as anything other than one of divine nature is basically zero.
When I first heard the message of the gospel as a non-Christian high school student, that my sins could be forgiven by God, that God loved me, He loved Bill Craig, and that I could come to know Him and experience eternal life with God, I thought to myself, and I'm not kidding, I thought, if there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing. And so my attitude toward this is just the opposite of Kyle's. Far from raising the bar or the epistemic standard that Christianity must meet to be believed, I lower it. I think that this is a message which is so wonderful, so fantastic, that if there's any evidence that it's true, then it's worth believing in.
How do arguments from personal experience perform in the result category? Well, this one is hard to judge. To approach this obliquely, consider the planet Jupiter. On a clear night, we can stare down a telescope and experience Jupiter, and doing this gives us decent reason to believe that Jupiter exists. However, this experience doesn't tell us everything about Jupiter, does it? From our vantage point, we don't experience the planet's weight, distance, or whether it's got any form of life. Likewise, even if a theist had experience of God, this wouldn't give them reason to insist that God is all-loving or all-powerful, would it? Or put it this way, do you really think that you could tell the difference between immense finite power and infinite power? I don't. If you've witnessed an act of great kindness, do you really think you could infer from that omnibenevolence? Really? No. Personal experiences, even if factual, only get us so far. They need to be combined with other arguments. They need to be combined with scripture. Needless to say, arguments from personal experience smash the intuition category. Unlike every other argument for God's existence, which requires conscious reasoning, experience is raw, with intuition going hand in hand with instinct. It's difficult to convince theists that the libertarian free will that they feel they're experiencing isn't as clean-cut as their intuition insists, and for the same intuitive pressure, it's very difficult to convince theists who believe they've experienced the divine to question their raw disposition. What about refutation? How do arguments from personal experience hold up? For reasons we'll delve into, not very well. To apply the logical form elsewhere, how well would you say that arguments from personal experience of Bigfoot hold up? The fact that those who claim to have experienced Bigfoot are hard to persuade otherwise isn't indicative of how defensible the argument is. One objection to arguments from personal experience is the mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive experiences of other personal experiences. If we are to believe the Hindu's personal experience, then we must reject the Christian's, and vice versa. What's more, this exhaustive situation can be applied to alleged experiences of the same God. If, for instance, one Christian experiences seeing or feeling their atheist loved ones in heaven, then, according to this Christian, the alternative Christian God, who only grants salvation on the condition of belief in and worship of Jesus, doesn't exist. There are 8 billion humans alive at present, and the majority of them haven't experienced the divine. And, as just discussed, those who apparently have experienced the divine often experience facts that contradict other personal experiences. So, if there is a God, then why is he so discriminatory in who he reveals himself to? There's plenty of evil people that have claimed to have experienced God, and are now adamant or were adamant that they're going to heaven. But what of the bulk of philosophers and scientists, who happen to be atheists? Why are they so forsaken? Personally, I think the only way for theists to deal with this objection, at least successfully, is to endorse universalism, the view that all human beings will ultimately be saved. However, there's a reason universalism isn't mainstream. As Craig and others have pointed out, the holy books are pretty clear on the limited suites in heaven. Finally, let's consider the most obvious objection to personal experiences, an objection that even the most devout endorse and even issue in any other domain of discourse. Humans are not perfect. I mean, just look at the A and B square in this image. They're obviously different colours, aren't they? Except, no, they're the same colour. Here, I'll fill in a line between them. And this is just one of countless optical illusions. Lawyers are well aware of our propensity to rewrite memories, including vital details, and psychologists and neurologists make a field day out of the various hallucinations we endure. It's like, bro, when I had a near-death experience, I could see heaven's door. God was inviting me in. Yeah, I bet you could, because it just definitely 100% couldn't have been that your pupils were dilating, resulting in overexposure. No, like God, you're infallible. Right then, where will we put arguments from personal experience? What tier? Well, despite the extremely problematic nature of personal experiences, and the many compelling objections, which, again, even the most devout recognise as means for disqualification in other conversations, personal experiences are, obviously, extremely compelling. Let me again play that clip from Craig.
And I think that the witness of the Holy Spirit is entirely adequate to both justify and warrant the knowledge that Christianity is true.
Craig's saying that personal experience is all that's needed to believe in not only that there's something supernatural, or that gods exist, or that there exists just one single God, or that there exists one single triomni God, but that specifically Christianity is true, says it all. So I'm going to stick personal experience in A tier. Once someone insists that they can't be wrong, refutation is impossible, and the conversation is over. Well then, there we have it, the most prominent and popular arguments for God's existence, and the Modal Ontological argument ranked into a tier list. As exhausting as this project has been, it's been a blast. To keep the conclusion brief, I want to express my utmost gratitude to John Perry and Joe Schmid for very kindly checking over the parts of my video that trespass over their fields of expertise. And I want to thank all of you watching. And look, I'm not just saying thanks for the sake of it, I really do mean it. Not to get soppy on you, but I want you to know that I'm very much aware of how lucky I am to be doing what I'm doing. In just about every other possible world, my upbringing would have confined me, it would have ensured that I miss the learning opportunities that I've so enjoyed. I'm very fortunate that you, strangers, fellow apes, enjoy my content and believe in my project of counter-apologetics. Lastly, I want to thank all of you that support the channel on Patreon and YouTube members. Patreon is by far my primary income, and despite the difficulties we've faced over the last 2 years, you've kept Rationality Rules afloat. Like us all, and to be transparent, the channel is struggling, but even if I have to go back to being a full-time graphic designer, know that your financial help will always ensure a video every once in a while. Much love all, take care of yourselves.